program. All that stuff.
I should.
And she gets real busy.
I guess we can go ahead and get started.
About 15.
You all probably know Bob.
No.
Brecha. Bob. Director of the Sustainability Program at the University of Dayton.
Okay.
Okay, so since I actually know most of you, but not everybody, so let me just say a couple words about myself and why you should come and listen to me talk about this stuff. And thanks for inviting me to give this presentation. My name is Bob Brecha. My wife Katie and I have been in the village for about 30 years, 31 years, something like that. I've been at UD for the same amount of time. And I'm a physicist by training. I was in the physics department there, but about 15 to 20 years ago, I started switching to more environmental issues, both here with the things we do with our solar hot water and straw bale house and things like that. And then that carried over into what I do at the university, where I started doing more with renewable energy, climate change, and helped found the sustainability program at the university. So we've now got a major and a minor in sustainability, and I'm no longer a professor of physics, I'm a professor of sustainability. And so, yeah, that's something that I felt important enough that I changed everything I did. I changed my whole career. I got out of the basement where I was working with lasers and atoms in a laboratory to start thinking about how to look at environmental issues and renewable energy issues. That's what I'm going to really talk about today. And I want to actually keep my presentation fairly short and then have mostly questions. So what I'd really like to do, I mean, here's the nice tame version of the title. The actual version I gave Carolyn was this, but I'll use it as an outline for what I'm going to say. So are we in a climate crisis? How do we know what's coming next and what's to be done? And I'm actually going to emphasize maybe the last part quite a bit, because I think we've all heard a lot of stories about climate change, but we maybe need to hear more good stories, or at least somewhat good stories about what we can do, what's going on that's positive. Okay, so we don't need to read all these things, and I'll make this available if anybody wants to go through and click through all the links and all that kind of thing. Are we in a climate crisis? So down in the lower left, I've got my little subtitles here. Fractions. This is all within about the last year or so. 40 degrees Celsius, 105 degrees Fahrenheit in England. Medicanes. These are hurricanes in the Mediterranean that have been starting to form. In Argentina, they had temperatures for long periods of time in the hundreds at a time when they don't usually expect that. Our daughter was actually there during that time. Talking about riding her bike on a winery tour in 100-degree temperatures, which seemed a little crazy. East Africa droughts, and then that's followed often by flooding events. So they all belong together somehow. And then in this year in Emilia-Romagna in northern Italy, there were billions of dollars worth of damage due to flooding. Now, keep in mind that one along with the rest of these, because it's going to be important for what I'm going to say for the next section. So I did decide to do this with graphs. I was going back and forth, not doing any PowerPoint, but I'm going to show some stuff and we'll see how that goes. So this is about 2,000 years worth of temperatures for the average temperature of the Earth. There's the fuzzy stuff is how uncertain that is, because 1,000 years ago it's harder for us to know what was exactly happening. But basically what you see is that the last 150 years or so, the temperature has gone way above what it was in the last few thousand years, and probably in the last 10,000 years. That means as long as there's been civilizations, we have temperatures now that humans have not seen on average. That seems like a pretty important point to tell us something about a climate crisis, that it's not only do we have these temperatures, but the change is really fast. And that's what causes trouble often, is that it's moving so fast, faster than we can adapt well as human societies. The right-hand side of this, we'll see in a minute. Okay, so here's a kind of a concrete example that I really like. How does climate change work? It's not just temperatures. So this is just a sketch of how you can think about birds laying eggs the eggs hatch, so the hatchlings come out. When the hatchlings come out, they need food. And then after they've gotten their food, their fledglings, they can leave the nest. Over time, over thousands of years, the system, our ecosystem has developed itself, has evolved so that the peak mass of caterpillars that feed on certain kinds of trees arrives at the same time as the fledglings. Or as the hatchlings need food. Okay, so you hatchlings come out, everything's worked out, they all time together so that the hatchlings actually get food so they can fledge. Perfect. But the birds react to light more than anything else. The trees and their leafing out reacts to temperature. So as the temperature goes up, the leaves of the trees will come out earlier. The caterpillars then react to that and feed earlier. So by the time the peak mass of caterpillars has already gone past, that's when the hatchlings come out and would like to have food, but it's already gone past. So this mismatch in systems, because one of them is dependent on temperature, one of them is dependent on light, which doesn't change. That's the kind of thing we're talking about with ecosystems, where the climate change, the global warming, with climate change, the whole system gets out of whack and it can't adjust fast enough on these timescales at which the temperature is changing. There's a lot of other examples of this, but to bring this down to, there's the sad bird. It doesn't. We published a paper, some colleagues and I, of an amateur scientist, a citizen scientist here in the Miami Valley, who was for 28 years was taking walks in the same area and noting down the first day of flowering of dozens of species of flowers. And she was just recording this in a diary. She was not a scientist, or she was a citizen scientist, but she wasn't trying to do anything. It's just that 28 years after she began, we got a hold of her records. And then we could look and see over those 28 years how flowering was happening over time for different species. And so this is just one example, but the main point is that we did find out, yes, for warmer winters, the flowers would blossom earlier in our Miami Valley. Right here, we could actually see a pretty strong signal of warmer temperatures causing earlier flowering. And the next piece of that was we found, yes, the temperatures in the winter were getting warmer as well. So we closed that loop and said, yes, the temperature is getting warmer. That warming is causing the flowers to bloom earlier. Now, we didn't carry it back to the birds and all of that, but just right here in the region, we could see these effects. And for me, especially interesting was that this person did all of these observations, just careful observations over a couple of decades that we could then later use. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just writing a diary. Okay. So how do we know? That was the evidence. Is there a climate crisis? I mean, the early flowering is not necessarily a climate crisis, but a sign that things are changing pretty quickly. How do we know? Well, we've known for well over 100 years that burning fossil fuels is going to cause more CO2 in the atmosphere, which is going to cause warming. And that's going to trigger all these other things. It's really remarkable how long we have known this. I mean, the first ideas that this would happen were in the mid-1850s. We're in the 1850s. So this is not new science at all. Calculations were done about how much temperature would change if you put a certain amount of coal or natural gas or oil emissions into the atmosphere well over 100 years ago, almost 130 years ago. Okay, not new. Here's the point I want to make with this graph. I mean, it's just lots of coal being burned. Doesn't matter what the x-axis or the y-axis is so much as it's just a lot, and it's gotten more. So that's when I was born. Now, look to the right of that line. That's sort of mass is how much fossil fuels have been burned since I was born. To the left of that line is the total amount of fossil fuels that were emitted before I was born. The total amount of carbon emissions, the total amount of fossil fuels burned before I was born. Some of you are older than I am, which means that it might be even more pronounced, but something like 80 to 90% of all of the CO2 emissions in history are in my lifetime. You sometimes hear, oh, we've been burning fossil fuels for a couple 100 years, and so this isn't a problem. It's my generation, basically, and my parents' generation that have been doing this, really since the Second World War. It was the the giant mass of most of the emissions. So this is something that is really, I don't want to make it a blame game, but in some sense, it's really the generation of those of us in this room who are then making these changes that the next generation is going to have to deal with. Right? That's kind of what's that?
Flaring.
Flaring is when if you dig out oil from the ground and then gas, often natural gas comes with the oil, and you don't know what to do with it, you just burn it. And so instead of using it even for something useful, you just burn it, which is better than letting it just escape into the atmosphere, but it's a significant contributor. I mean, it's one of these lower ones way down here, though. Okay? It's mostly coal, oil, natural gas.
I was wondering, how to do with sunflower.
No, it's really fossil fuels. This is all kind of fossil fuels, and then the cement industry. Okay, so here's the right-hand side of that graph, because now we want to talk about how do we know that we're doing this? What scientists can do, this is now just blowing up that right-hand side there from 1850. What scientists can do is they can make computer models, but that really means we just put all the physics we know and all the chemistry we know, all the geology we know, biology into equations that we put into a computer, and then we see what happens over time with the temperature as CO2, as natural processes take place. And what we find is that if you don't include our contribution from fossil fuels, then you would expect the temperature to have looked like this green line. If you include what we've done with fossil fuels, you would expect to see this line here, and then superimposed on that is really the actual temperature. So the point is that the computer models, just basically the physics we know agrees with what we see. If we get rid of the physics we know because of what we've done, at the part we've added to the atmosphere, then things would look very different. It would be just a constant temperature. You wouldn't see temperature change. Now, why is that important? I mean, this is a little bit arcane here, but the reason is how do we know? Because you often hear, is some event caused by climate change? That's the question always comes. Is there a big hurricane? Was it caused by climate change? Is there a drought? There's a drought. Was it caused by climate change? Well, if we think about this as a simple example, these computer models can actually say, here's what we see happening. Here's what would happen if we left out all of our contributions. And the basic idea is this temperature wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't had the CO2. Having the CO2 is what leads to these global average temperatures. Now they take it a step further. There's a scientist, primarily a woman, Frederica Otto in England, who has sort of founded this idea of science, this idea of attribution science. What can we say about a certain event? We can't say it was caused by climate change, and this is lined up with all of the earlier ones I had on that first slide. Without human-caused climate change, without our contribution, 40-degree temperatures would have been extremely unlikely. That means there would have been maybe a 1% chance, not that something like that could happen. This Medicane, Daniel, that led to massive flooding in Bulgaria and Greece just a few weeks ago, is 10 times more likely, 40% more intense. So you see the game they play is they kind of say, if we add in the human piece, then things become 10 times more likely, 60 times more likely, 100 times more likely. That's really all you can say. You can't say it was caused by it, but you can say it was made much, much more likely, 100 times more likely is pretty much more likely. In other words, it wouldn't have happened basically otherwise. This was one case, the one in northern Italy, where these same scientists, they look at it, and this one they said it was probably not so much climate change. It was really much more an extreme event, which could have happened anyway, and then some poor planning as well that led to it. And so often they come up with this conclusion that it's maybe climate made a little bit of an impact, but often it's also just, especially in poorer areas, Emilia-Romagna is not one, but especially poor areas, it's often just really poor infrastructure, poverty, and many other things that are exacerbated by climate change. So there's a lot of other things going on at the same time. So they're not just looking for every case to blame on climate change. They actually, a lot of their cases, they say, yeah, it's either hard to tell or it's probably not climate change the major impact. I want to show this just for a, actually, I'm not, this one. Here's the message. Every increment of global warming intensifies multiple and concurrent hazards. Deep, rapid, and sustained reductions, that's going to be what can we do, in greenhouse gases would lead to a discernible slowdown in global warming, et cetera. So basically, and maybe I want to say this the very first two words here is every increment. That is every bit we do. There is no such thing as there is, better be a little bit careful. There is no point where we can say humanity ends because we hit 2 degrees C above pre-industrial temperatures, as you'll often hear things described. There is no point where that happens. We can have so-called tipping points where something might cascade, but basically everything we can do to limit any amount of warming helps. That's really the key message I would say we need to always keep in. Anything we do, any little bit of warming we can inhibit is good. Okay, so let me just look at a couple of ways, again, the way we can describe this. A 50-year event, that's something that happens on average every 50 years. It could happen, twice in 10 years or something, but on average, it's over a long period, it's going to happen only every 50 years. But now, these events like high temperature heat waves, basically, are occurring almost on average about 5 times in 50 years, not once in 50 years. And in the near future, 1.5 or 2 degrees, so we're at 1 degree now, roughly 10 times or so. So we're talking about now things that our grandparents would have seen every 50 years. We're seeing every 10 years, and pretty soon we're going to be seeing every 5 years or less. That's the sort of statistics or the sort of attribution that we can think about. And not only will they occur more often, but they'll be more intense. So it'll be a few degrees hotter. So we have a heat wave, not only do we have a heat wave that lasts a few days or a couple of weeks, but it's going to be a hotter heat wave than it would have been previous. So both things go together. And likely precipitation, the same thing. That's one of the things that we have to worry about a little bit here. These are 2 of them in Dayton that are our biggest worries are more heat waves and more really heavy precipitation. I just saw a talk yesterday where he said, it was this state of Ohio climatologist talking, said that I think it was 40% of our rain last year came on 7 days. So it was very heavy. It's not just it's all spread out through the year. It's really these extreme events are giving us a lot of our rain. So even if you don't have more rain overall, it's coming really all at once.
Yeah.
But I like this picture best. I mean, this gives an idea. We have to ask a lot of questions behind this, but this gives an idea of what we're looking at in maybe 50 years. Summer in Ohio is Arkansas summer. Arkansas summer, from everything I've heard, is not so pleasant. Right?
Horrible.
We just moved from there. Okay. You're moving back. Over 20 years. This is 60, 70 years. See, and I think I wouldn't take this, completely seriously, but the trend is this kind of idea that you've got, right? That what we're doing is we're migrating our own climate to places where it didn't used to be, even if it's Missouri and Western Kentucky. And the winters will become more like Virginia, okay? Which is, okay, that may not be so bad, but all of this has then implications for the ecosystems, right? If we have these warmer winters, then the plants and the birds get out of sync, and then we have all those problems. So this is a kind of picture that I like because it just sort of shows you the trend. Okay, what can we do? So we're doing, we're already on the 4th one. CO2 emissions have been going up and up and up. They need to go down to about 0 by 2050 to keep us within the Paris Agreement, which says 1.5 degrees C. We're already at 1 degree above 19th century. The main message, though, is we really need to get rid of carbon dioxide emissions by about mid-century. And then all greenhouse gases, that means methane from agriculture and a bunch of other things, that has to happen soon after that. So this is a big challenge. And we know we can't get rid of all of our emissions. So there's probably going to be a need for some technologies that give us negative emissions, which means maybe more forestation. So not instead of net losses of forest around the world, net gains in forest would help us. But it may mean some technologies too, where we capture carbon dioxide from different things like industrial processes or power plants and put it underground. And that's I mean, I'm very skeptical of that, but it's something that if we're going to meet this, it may be necessary. And then so there's other things here, but the main picture is that to kind of keep where scientists think we're going to be in this range here and not moving into this range, we're probably going to need to get to almost no carbon dioxide emissions, meaning effectively no coal, oil, or natural gas being burned by mid-century, 30 years from now, a little bit past mid-century. Okay. All right. So where are we and what does it look like? Right now, this is energy, just a pie diagram here. We use coal, oil, and natural gas for most of our energy now. What it will look like in 30 or 40 years, and there's plenty of studies that show we can do this. Solar, wind, and maybe a little bit of some other stuff left over. This is a particular set of people who say no nuclear and none of this carbon capture stuff. So they don't believe in any of that. Fine, but the basic picture is this: we're switching all of the way we use energy from fossil fuels to wind, solar, and a few other things. It's a big transition. And part of how we have to do that is the other motto here: get to net zero emissions by mid-century, electrify everything. Almost everything we can do has to be done with electricity. And then that electricity has to be solar and wind and renewable energy. That's the key to all of this. Right now, it's not. In the future, it will be. But the cool thing about this is that the cost of solar photovoltaics has dropped by 90+% in the last 20 years. The cost of wind has dropped by a factor of 3 in just the last 20 years. And the cost for batteries for vehicles has dropped by about 90% in the last 20 years. So these are all getting to be the most viable solutions. They're cheaper than the existing system, which is partly why we're seeing Larry Householder being marched to jail, because it's now a desperation move where you're saying this stuff is cheaper than fossil fuel and nuclear. I better, accept bribes to push things through the legislature to make sure that fossil fuels and nuclear stay around, because markets, free competition wouldn't work. So now they're suddenly saying, well, we'll just have to do bribes and make things happen.
What's the big argument against carbon capture?
Can I take that question right after I finish this, and then I'll but that's a really good question. So one of the things that happens is that we've underestimated solar, we've underestimated EVs over time. And this is a graph from something called the International Energy Agency. They do projections every year of how different technology is going to work and what we should be doing and what the policies show. And in each of these lines represents one of their additions over the last 20 years of their projections. And the black line is what solar PV has actually done, how much has been installed. So like this year, they say, well, here's where we are, but it's going to look like this in the future. And then it goes up like this. And they say, well, now we're here, it's going to look like this in the future. And so they go up here, this is 2018, here's where we are, and here's what's going to look like in the future. So they learn, right?
I'm not following what you're saying.
Okay.
What is PV?
So PV is solar photovoltaics, it's solar panels.
Yeah, got it.
How much are we going to install in the world? And what they're saying, basically, they're always saying not much more than we have now. We've installed this much, it's not going to go up much after that. It's not going to go much up. And so every year they kind of say, well, now we're here, it's not going to go up much after that. We're going to stop installing so much solar PV. And so here's now where we are in 2021. And they said, this is what it's going to look like in the future. And there's where we are in 2022, and there's where we're going to be in 2023. So these are really good scientists. They really know what they're doing at some level, but they always underestimate how much solar can do for us, how much people are willing to install. And the same thing is happening with electric vehicles. They're doing, how many electric vehicles are going to be sold? Well, here's where we are. It's going to look like this. Oh, well, it went up above that. Here's what it's going to look like now. Well, here's where it is. Well, here's what it's going to look like. And so the electric vehicles are doing the same thing. So both of these technologies are taking off much, much faster than even the sort of the best energy experts expect. That is a positive message. We can ask about some things there too. Okay. I'm not going to go through all this, but basically electric vehicles are cheaper to run now, save you several $100s a year in operating costs already. And heat pumps, that is changing a natural gas furnace for an electric heat pump, saves you several $100s a year already. Now you have, yes, upfront costs, of course, and all that, but these are things that are much more efficient. They use less energy. You can, as you electrify, that is the cars and your heating system, it becomes, you can use more and more renewable electricity and you decrease the carbon emissions. So you're moving from natural gas or from gasoline to electricity, which can be increasingly renewable. So this is the kind of move that we're needing to take and which is already happening. So here's my last slide. What's the biggest threat to the climate? I think it's indifference, not acting. It's conflict. We've seen that in Ukraine, that this is something that is clearly a global challenge and needs cooperation, and we're not seeing that much of that right now. So that's a real hindrance to this. And then climate change is only one of these things we have to worry about, but poverty, inequality, injustice, these are all really important pieces of this that have to be addressed with climate change. There's no separating out climate change from social justice issues, from poverty all around the world. So with that, yeah, then I'm just going to open up for questions. Thank you. Yeah, for listening here. Let me get the first question. What's wrong with carbon capture and storage? So what you're doing there is you're saying, I'm going to take a smokestack or a power plant, say, I'm going to do some chemistry, I'm going to capture all that CO2 that would have come out otherwise. I'm going to treat it, compress it, transport it somewhere, and bury it underground and hope that all of it stays there for 1,000 or a few thousand years. So in principle, scientists, geologists would say we could do that. It's pretty expensive. I mean, if we said that solar is already cheaper than other kinds of power, and now you add those other costs to natural gas or coal to catch the CO2 and bury it and all that, and you take a lot of electricity to do that, which means you need to generate even more electricity to make up for the fact that you're using electricity to capture your carbon. It's a little bit of a vicious circle here. And then experiences show that most people don't want to have that CO2 buried nearby. There's a lot that it's almost, I don't want to compare it to nuclear waste, but in that sense, it's something where we're taking a waste product of ours and we're burying it underground and hoping that nobody in the future has to deal with it. So this is a less of a scientific statement than my personal statement that says sustainability for me is not leaving problems for a future generation. Yeah. If we think that there's even a reasonable chance that it could be a problem. And so for me, that's a strong argument against the carbon capture. The storage is a big problem. Again, geologists would say, no, we can do that. Natural gas is also a gas. It was underground for millions of years before we tapped it. So we could fill up those cavities from which we extracted natural gas and put CO2 in. Of course, we've already poked holes into them, but still that there's, that it just leaves a little bit of an odd taste to think about doing that, but it could be necessary at some level. Yeah, let's see.
When a plant makes nutrition for itself, it's using sunlight and CO2.
Yes.
So when you raise the CO2 in the atmosphere, what happens to the tissue in the plant?
Okay, so there's a couple things. So the question was, if when plants grow, they grow by using CO2 and sunlight, photosynthesis, and if you increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, oh, that sounds good. That means plants will grow better because we have more CO2 in the atmosphere. That is true up to a point when people do experiments. There have been a lot of experiments where they do this. Take a big field, cover it, and then put extra CO2 and see how things grow. The problem is there are a couple of problems. One is that has limits to how much you can increase. Second is that we don't have just CO2, we have higher temperatures. And so that actually plays a role with plants that they can't respire as well. And so then you end up with sort of limiting the amount that this extra CO2 can help plants grow. So it can have an increase. There's some evidence that in northern parts of like in Canada, Russia, there's actually more greening, there's more plant growth, but overall that's not the case. And because of the interplay between temperatures and CO2, for example, in the Amazon, there's a real worry that it's going to become a net source of CO2, not a sink for CO2.
So bottom line is we gotta quit burning stuff.
We got to quit burning stuff. I mean, we've been doing it for thousands of years. We dig stuff out of the ground and we burn it, and now we've got to do something else. I'm going to go back to David. No, yeah.
Another comment, there's another aspect of CO2 storage. You can speak to the bottom, I'm sure. If we pursue that path, it provides an argument for the fossil fuel industry to say, oh, we can keep burning, generating CO2 because we can recover it.
Yeah.
That's a little bit true, but not very much.
Yeah, and really by now, and we're lucky here, to be honest, that in most places in the world, solar is the cheapest source of electricity that you can install. And in most places in the US, I think the study I saw recently said 99% of coal plants in the US, it would be cheaper for the utility to shut down the coal plant that's already operating and build solar to replace it. And 99% of coal plants, operating them is more expensive than building new solar power. So we're lucky that we've gotten to that stage,
Yeah.
and we've gotten there because of what's called learning by doing, that as countries started doing more solar, they got better at it and it got cheaper. And then that meant more people could do it. And then it got cheaper. And then more people installed solar and then it got cheaper. And so we've really ratcheted down this cost of solar to where it's competitive with any other source of electricity. Yes.
I thought that solar panels have kind of a lifetime.
Yeah.
They're not, once you install them, they're not good forever.
That's right.
That they wear out. That maybe that big field that's down there near Antioch College and Antioch School. So what happens to that?
Okay, so that's really good. So the question is, what happens? What's the lifetime of the solar panels, and what happens at the end of that lifetime? The lifetime is the solar panels are guaranteed in almost all cases for 25 years. So
It's short.
power plants last 25 or 40 years, 25, 30, 40 years. So big power plants have a lifetime too. You're constantly putting new money into them. So it's short in the sense that if we were also, well, let me start with this. They're guaranteed for 25 years. We don't have much experience, but it seems that they're lasting longer than that. So that 30 years, 35 years is not unreasonable. On average, some are going to fail. But the second point, though, is really important. What happens at the end of that life? You've got these solar panels. What do you do with the waste from that? Well, there's two pieces of that. One is something like, I have to look at the number to be sure, 80 to 90% of the weight of a solar panel is aluminum and glass. We know how to deal with aluminum and glass. Okay. Then we have the other metals, and we have the other things that are bad for the environment if they just get into the environment. I have to say, I've seen some arguments that water running off of solar panels causes heavy metals to get into the ground, and that's just wrong. It's false. But that was one of the reasons used for forbidding solar to be installed in Miami Township. So it's just wrong. But anyway, the way I see this, and it's already starting to happen, both with solar panels and with batteries from vehicles, it's a business opportunity. Somebody's going to come along and say, oh, I can recover the rest of that 10% that's left over. I can figure out how to sort that out and turn it into recover those materials. And there are some solar panels that say they can recover 95% of their materials. So in fact, one company doesn't even really sell you solar panels. They kind of rent you them roughly, and then they make themselves, they guarantee that they will take back the materials in the end. So I think it's probably a business opportunity for somebody. And you can see, I saw a video online recently of a commercial lithium battery, car battery operation, where they've set up a factory to recover all the materials from the batteries. They run, it's really incredible. They run them through some kind of a shredder, and somehow all the stuff comes out separated that they need. So I don't think it's not a matter of me saying everything is going to be just this engineering solution that's going to make us all happy. But I think there are certain questions that come up and that will come up that can be solved as an engineering question. Okay? So I don't think everybody should go out and buy a battery SUV because we're all fine now. I think we should be really careful about what we drive and how much we drive and what kind of cars we buy, and use other modes of transportation when we can. But for what's left over when we need it, then I think engineers and business people will figure out, oh, I can make some money off of this, and I can figure out how to do this process to recover those materials. So I think that's going to be really important. We just haven't needed it yet. So it's not come up. Yeah, Louise.
From the questions asked, it occurs to me, not that I want to accuse anybody, but that this conflict of not wanting this change because you want to keep the old, and the old has given power to people, and I can see your nice way of doing this, that it leads to other questions, and I think in this country, because maybe it gotten so rich by doing these other things, those things stand in the way, and we say government for the people, by the people, but it isn't really like that, because I mean, it goes to this thing about what can I do? Well, you wait for someone to tell you what you can do. Then you could buy a little bit of thing, not maybe the poor, but those that have money could make it quicker and easier, because it doesn't stand to reason that you would hold on to something that would destroy the land under your feet. You know what I mean? What kind of insight is that? And to then I have, it's such a nice thing that you did up there, and I'm afraid I lose my train of thought, but it's so, it affects other people, it affects the poor. I can't believe when I hear on radio every day that somebody cannot take their children to the doctor. And at the same time, there are laws passed that you cannot have abortions. You know what I mean? You think someone is insane.
So I think
they'll help you if you have these children. Well, now they're not helping, you know what I mean? And so that we tolerate, and we don't see that we can do something. I mean, I'm an old lady and I have to learn how to drive this electric thing with buttons. I do have a little Fiat that goes, well, hopefully it stays on the road, but when I drive it, but okay, I feel like I do something. I gave away this big car that I had for 13 years, and it was I think it was a Mercedes Benz, but I didn't buy it. It just happened to fall in my hands. But I'm saying I'm not wise as far as money. those are not wise, and I can hardly talk when I get excited because I'm so angry.
Yeah.
Every day when I listen to the radio, I feel so sorry for the poor in this country that have been stupidified, that have been enslaved still, whether they're black or white, enslaved with these ideas that nothing can be done, and the politicians that you select are playing football games with each other.
So let me, I mean,
Insane.
there's a whole bunch there that, I mean,
Yeah.
that's really important, and there's at least one thing I can say is that there's actually a lot of evidence that when one person in a neighborhood gets an electric car, then that increases the likelihood that other people in that neighborhood get an electric car. When one person puts solar panel on the roof, that increases the likelihood that other people do. So that's again this sense that everything you do has an impact. It's not just, I think it's obvious, no matter what I do, it's not going to matter for that big graph of CO2 emissions, but it does make a contribution in that longer term. The other thing I would say is that you're exactly right. I mean, we have to worry about these social justice issues, the poverty issues, not just here, but globally. Renewable energy, I would say, is the best option for many of these countries where 2 to 3 billion people do not have electricity or not enough electricity for basic needs. Do not have modern cooking. That is, that they're using gathered wood or dung to cook. Renewable electricity actually gives you an option of going in there and not having to build a giant power plant to where somebody's going to invest $1 billion to build a power plant. And until it goes online, and by the way, right, there's corruption in governments and so that money goes off in all different directions besides this power plant. But until it's up and running, you have zero electricity. In the case of solar panels and even wind turbines, you build one, even if you plan to build 1,000 to install 1,000 solar panels, as soon as you put up a few, you can get electricity. You can stop the project in the middle and you've got half as much electricity. So this renewable energy can change the equation for how energy gets to places that have not had it before. I think it's really one of the key points. You could have this distributed energy that isn't all controlled by a central utility or a government. You can actually move the energy out to places that need it in smaller quantities, build it up slowly. You have 2 solar panels, and you have 10 solar panels. There's a question about whether that can lead to enough development for the poorest countries, but still getting started in that direction, I think is really a remarkable change in how this could. You could imagine it leading to a lot more democratization of the energy system and therefore of people's ways of making a living. Not guaranteed, but it could be. Let me go back here to Chief.
Yeah, I mean, like just go on part of what you're saying, how do we put pressure on, because isn't it true that like over 70% of carbon emissions globally are put out by like the same big organizations that we've all heard of? And so like individual things are great, and also they can also help save us money. But how do you recommend putting pressure? Because that is a really large number, over 70%.
Yeah.
And I mean, that would solve a lot of it, and not just the individual things that seem micro compared to a larger percentage.
I think my take on that is still the individual actions, because we're already seeing this in that every time you're putting up solar panels and wind turbines, then that's less electricity being generated by fossil fuels. And as it's cheaper, I mean, the utilities are fighting right now, and the oil companies are going to be fighting for their survival. It's not as quick as we would hope, but because they're not changing, they're not switching into being, for the most part, into being energy companies who say, okay, we see that the horizon for fossil fuels is coming quickly. We better switch to wind and solar and battery, whatever they want to switch to. They're doubling down and bribing politicians and doing things like that to make sure they stay alive and can produce their stuff. But it's a losing battle. It may not be quickly enough lost, but it's a losing battle because, I mean, the car companies have already said, most of the major car companies have said, we're not gonna build any more gasoline vehicles after 2035.
Mhm.
That's 10 years from now, that the car companies have said this. I mean, in this case, California said, we're not gonna allow new gasoline vehicles to be registered after 2035. The car companies had already said that. They already said, we're not gonna build any cars for gasoline cars after 2035. So California was trailing the car companies in that case.
Mhm.
The oil companies have said, okay, yeah, let's see. Denmark, Norway now has 90% sales of electric vehicles. The world has, I think it's 10 or 15%. Europe has gone up to 20 or 25%. The US is 10%. That's moving much faster, like I said here, than people expect. And every one of those cars now is not using gasoline. There is a coming, I say, collapse in sales of gasoline vehicles within the next 5 years or so. It's already decreasing. The number of gasoline cars being sold around the world has decreased by something like 20% since its peak a few years ago. And the expectation is it could be 35% off of its peak in less than 5 years. I mean, this is major for these manufacturers and for the oil companies. The same International Energy Agency, which I was sort of criticizing for their projections, their director just came out a couple days ago in the Financial Times in a piece and said, the peak in world oil demand is coming within a couple of years. Within a couple of years, we're going to just start seeing oil demand, not the supply, the demand going down because electric vehicles are taking off so quickly. That's, I mean, so on the one hand, I understand why you're saying, we need to do something. I think that something is happening almost by itself, and we need to figure out how to do this ourselves. And for those who can do so, which I realize that a lot of people can't, but if you can buy an electric vehicle, if you can do solar panels, do it. I mean, the average price of a new car in the US right now is $48,000.
Right.
Average price, not an EV, of an average car is $48,000. I mean, car and truck, because mostly we sell big trucks. So buy a $30,000, if you can, a car. Economists say that we're all rational and we all maximize our well-being, all this other stuff, which is kind of nonsense, but if we did that, everybody would buy the cheapest car you possibly could, because what you want to do with a car is get from one place to another. You would just buy the cheapest car you could. Well, obviously we don't. We buy stuff that's more expensive because we like a Toyota rather than the cheapest Chevy or whatever it is. We spend money on stuff that has no payback whatsoever. It will never pay itself off. When I first bought a hybrid car 20 years ago, the question was always, oh, you're paying $20,000 for that. When's it ever going to pay off? Well, you just bought a $30,000 car and had a sunroof in it. When's your sunroof going to pay off in your car?
Yeah.
Right? That it won't. It simply won't. My hybrid car will. It may take 10 or 15 years, but it's actually going to pay off that extra. So it's this different way of thinking about some of these things where we say we know where we spend money on stuff. And I know there are a lot of people who don't have the extra money, but still we make decisions about spending that are not rational. It's just we do stuff we want to do. The argument about solar panels is always, when are they going to pay off? How long are they going to take to pay off? Well, you just got a marble countertop on your kitchen renovation for $10,000. It's never going to pay off. I'm sorry. The solar panels will pay off. So that's the kind of thing I think we need to really think a little bit more about how we do things we can, how that sets examples for others, hopefully. And we, like I said, we do see that it spreads when people do that.
What about, where is the technology as far as storage? We're talking about, I come from the West. You have vast areas in the West where they get lots and lots of sunshine. The problem is, how do you store that from solar places and get it to where it needs to go?
Yeah, that's so storage of solar and wind.
Yes.
I mean, storage is going to be a big thing that is going to be increasingly important. Right now, the best technology is lithium batteries, like the ones in cars. So we have to worry about all that We don't want to just start extracting minerals from places and leaving other countries and people in other countries at a disadvantage either. We need to think about that. But there are other battery technologies that are increasingly viable, that don't use lithium, and that will be an important part of this. The amount of storage that's being put into going in along with solar and wind projects around the country and around the world has taken off like all these other in just the last few years. Because you're putting in huge amounts of solar and wind, you need that stability due to the to store the energy. And there are a dozen different storage technologies. There's a lot of different technologies that people are working on, and I think that's another one where there's a concrete challenge. Sun doesn't shine at night, wind doesn't blow all the time. We need to be able to store energy. That's the kind of thing engineers do pretty well. They say, okay, here's the challenge, so we got to figure out how to solve it. Again, I don't think everything is an engineering challenge, but that is. So it's really now gotten to the point where solar or wind with battery storage is cheaper than any other source of energy. But there's also things like hydrogen that you can generate with renewable energy, and then that can be stored and used to generate electricity. It's inefficient, but so are power plants. So these things are all bubbling up in ways that are pretty positive, I have to say. Yeah, John?
Do you recommend a particular storage battery type situation for home solar?
To be honest, I haven't looked that much myself. I mean, I'm just relying on the grid. And so I haven't done that. I can't say I can make a recommendation. I need to look at it more. Yeah.
I think it's way expensive.
They're still way expensive for homes. Yeah. So it's, yeah. Yes. And then I'll come over to Lynn. Yeah.
Okay, so is anybody working on some kind of a conversion of a gasoline powered car? Because when you talk about, drinking a can of pop, or you're gonna recycle that little can, kudos, but cars are huge. And to buy a car and drive it for an extremely long period of time is one. Not throwing all of that material into the junk heap pile. And I'm just curious. I mean, I drive really old cars by choice because I never get rid of them. But I also am keen to try, I'm geothermal and all that, but my automobiles are, I'm sure, pretty disgraceful. But they're like me, we're old, but I don't want to be like, I mean, is anybody doing any work with?
I mean, we could recover lots of material from cars. They end up in junkyards a lot of times. I mean, it used to be the case that German auto manufacturers were responsible for their cars, kind of cradle to grave.
That the industry and the cost of the recycling of the materials from the cars is yet another just huge energy consuming the process itself. And
it is, but there's for cars, and this will be for gasoline cars, it's a little different for battery electric vehicles, but the operating use of energy for a car is about 8 to 10 times more than the energy that goes into building the car. So really, over the lifetime of the car, if you can get a car that's more fuel efficient, much more fuel efficient, then it makes up for the cost of energy cost from making that new car pretty quickly. So but on the other hand, that's an energy cost. That's not what do you do with the stuff?
It's not
the materials.
And
I agree. I mean, that what should have happened decades ago is the car manufacturers should have been required to take back all their cars when they're at the end of life. And that should have just been part of the deal.
Still, but
that's not happening.
The biggest part of the car is the same.
Yeah.
I just don't, I really think that some kind of a conversion process, and if we're ever gonna make it where people that are not of means or cars, they're not, who's going out and buying new cars, we'll buy an electric one, kudos, but
but they're expensive.
Concern with the people who aren't going out and buying new cars, they're gonna get all these other cars, and I just think that there needs to be some incentive for a conversion.
So Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's gonna be a long process. It's gonna be a long process to switch cars last. 50% of cars that are, let's see, if you take a model year, 15 years later, 50% of those cars are still on the road. So it's, cars last a long time these days. It's
Yes.
not like in the 70s, really. They've made them last a lot longer, which is good. But yeah, it makes the switch over to a new technology that much longer. Let me come to Lynn and then I'll come over.
I just wondered if you needed water.
What's that? Oh, no, I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm fine. Yes.
Yeah, and so I drive a Prius, have for a long.
Yeah.
And, but one of the things, one of the things that goes into making that such a economical car to drive is it's not built like. I mean, it's got a plastic gas tank. It uses really hard tires that have no grip in wet weather, to get better gas mileage and stuff like that. So the hybrid cars and electric cars are made a little different.
Yeah.
They
are, and so I gave that number of the whatever 8 or 9 times more to drive the car than to build it. It actually, that balance goes down when you have a hybrid car because they get much better gas mileage, so you're using less during the operation, and they usually take more energy to build, and so that kind of ratio of how much you use. So the arguments change a little bit. Battery electric vehicles are going to be also the same thing. So clearly, hanging on to your cars as long as possible is a good thing, but what do we do with cars and other vehicles when they reach the end of the life? I mean, that's something we need to think about, but we probably should have been thinking about that. We should have been thinking about that the last 50 years, and we haven't really been doing that. So this is my, let's see, one of my little, the points that peeves me a little bit is that the environmental solutions seem now to have to be completely perfect in all aspects, whereas a lot of these same problems existed. I mean, mining lithium with child labor somewhere. Of course, it's wrong, and we need to not do that. But what about boring for oil in Nigeria, where you have children that are suffering from that all the time? We never worried about that. We don't worry about that. Just over there. But now the new ecological solutions, they should be better, but they also seem to have to be perfect before we'll accept them. We'll do everything we can to say how bad electric vehicles are, and forgetting that, okay, we've got junkyards full of scrap from gasoline engine cars. We're polluting the atmosphere, we're doing all these other things. We do need to look at all these things. And as I always tell my students, as part of sustainability, we don't want to go forward making mistakes that we can see will be mistakes. We need to avoid them. So we need to think through these. Then we probably better hold the old technologies to that same standard. Think through your whole life cycle of what's being used and thrown away.
Been on the street for like 33 years. All the way back in the late 80s, they had talked about electrifying heating, but they said as long as the public, the government doesn't embrace it, they can't work. So I know they wanted to do this because it's actually, they always felt it would be cheaper to actually build because of all the tooling. And all that for the gas.
So the comment is about the auto industry building electric vehicles long ago, and then them not being embraced by the public. They were really expensive, but they were, the whole EV, Chevy EVs. That whole story that some of you've seen from Jim's movie. Yeah, this is a long history. It actually goes back further than that, because in the early 1900s, there was a battle between gasoline, electric, and steam cars, which would win. They were all on the street at the same time. The problem with electric was the batteries. But it now seems we've gotten over that hump, and so that's almost certainly going to be the technology that takes over. But it's we need to think it through carefully. We need to think through the waste problems and the abuse of people in other countries to try to extract their minerals. We need to think about all that carefully. There's no doubt. Yeah, there.
So I'm listening and I see the poverty inequality. So I hear you saying market forces are gonna help us. I haven't heard you say anything about legislation. Legislation has been prime in solar. I know it as far back in the eighties.
Yeah.
Government would throw money and people
Yeah.
come out of the woodwork, little projects, the back project was then 20 or 30 years later, something. This time seems different.
But I think
And I'm wondering, when you're discussing these things with your engineering students, because engineers love to engineer, and I wonder how you inject that.
I mean, that's a constant theme, because I teach only a few engineering classes, mostly I teach broader sustainability classes, so we're always talking about all these issues. The technology and the science, the social aspects and the economic aspects, so that part is just part and parcel of what we do. And you're right, so I am not actually that strong a proponent of leaving these things to market forces. They work in some situations, that's good. But I would claim that Germany started the greatest, maybe one of the greatest international, let's call it social and environmental programs about 20 years ago, when they, by legislation, said, we are going to, if you put solar panels on your roof, we're going to guarantee you 20 years of, I think it was 65 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity for 20 years if you do that. We're not going to give you any money up front. You got to pay for it up front, and then we'll guarantee you for 20 years. And then we're going to decrease that amount every year. So if you do it next year, you only get 55 cents. If you do it the next year, you only get 45 cents. So it was already planned in that, oh, if I do it right away, I get more, but the solar panels were extremely expensive. But this learning by doing things that a lot of people said, oh, this is going to pay off, so I'm going to do it. And as more people installed solar panels, the cost went down. And so within between 5 and 10 years, they had to really ratchet down that guarantee. Not the past ones, they didn't make it retroactive, but for the future, they said, oh, now if you do it, you only get 10 cents or 12 cents or whatever it was. But it spurred the solar photovoltaic revolution around the world. It cost Germany a lot of money. But what happened was China actually jumped in on that.
Yeah.
Started manufacturing solar panels, and not in a bad way. They just said, oh, this is a good opportunity. China installs by far more, they install more solar panels and wind turbines than the rest of the world combined right now. So China jumped on that, and they were able to out compete Germany. All of the German solar jobs went away, which I also find interesting. Germany, like the US, fights for coal jobs, like tooth and nail for every 10,000 jobs that may disappear. They'll spend billions to keep them. 100,000 solar jobs were lost in Germany in the period of a few years, and they did nothing, not a single thing. So 100, more than they ever had in the coal industry, were lost within a few years. So it's this weird thing where the fossil fuels have a lobby that allows them to keep going, and the same sorts of dynamics will happen for renewable energy, and it's like, okay, too bad. So
Isn't Germany's coal brown coal?
now it is.
Yeah.
They have a lot of black coal and brown coal, so it's super dirty.
Yeah, super.
It's horrible. Yeah. And that's what they burn, and it's really horrible. So yeah.
Let me preface my question by asking, do you know anything about an outfit called the International Panel on Climate Change?
Yeah.
IPCC?
Yeah. I actually helped, was a co-author in one volume of one chapter of one.
Don and I last week were in a conversation about this topic, and a fellow who most of us in the room know was being very contrarian, wouldn't you say? But he claimed that the IPCC was backing off on some statement that they had made that they claimed the world was misinterpreting. I'm not sure what exactly they were talking about, but I wonder if you know anything about this.
So their latest report, that bottom quote there, It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. Previous reports over the last 20 years have said it's highly likely, or we see signs of. It is unequivocal. That is the strongest language this group has. It really means 100% certainty. There's just no doubt. And this is a statement that was from, I mean, this gets too detailed, but they do what's called a summary for policymaker of their reports. Their reports are volunteer scientists coming together to evaluate the literature. This statement was approved by every single country, representatives from every single country government who is party to this, which is every single major country. So this is common language. You have to say this is the lowest common denominator language that was accepted and approved by every country. They have to approve this summary for policymakers word for word by word, every country unanimously. And so this.
Delphi consensus?
What's that?
A Delphi consensus?
No, it's just a nasty diplomatic negotiation process where Saudi Arabia tries to block everything that has to do with this, and the US blocks things. Plants, animals, everything in the. Yes, it's just a nasty process, but it is agreed word for word. And this is the lowest common denominator. So. And this IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they don't do any science themselves. They just evaluate the scientific literature. That's all they do, is they look at what's been published and they summarize. And there's thousands of scientists who take part in it. So it's probably the most careful, peer-reviewed science document that is ever created. It's.
Thank you.
Yeah, David. Maybe it should be the last, but I think we're supposed to leave it 8, right? Okay.
I always tell people that there's certainly one of the most important thing to do for climate change. Yeah. I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit.
Yeah.
No, I mean.
I was gonna say, I didn't think this was gonna be a particularly hostile process.
Yeah.
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 I mean, so policy matters. I mean, the stuff I was maybe concentrating on maybe too much were these markets and the costs, but policy matters, and having the right frameworks to be able to, and that's what the Biden administration has done with IRA and Bill, as they're called. These are the world that cares about climate stuff is looking at what the Biden administration passed and are just amazed at how good it is. So that's something to really think about. They're imitating it. They're trying to say, oh, we can't go that far because they're putting money into these new technologies, trying to advance them. And so policy matters too, definitely.
Can I do one?
Yeah, Jane.
Okay, so the infrastructure required for the solar panels is really minimal compared to the other power plant type model. When you're talking about moving in to more remote areas or things like that, because there's always sunshine or wind, but it is the infrastructure. I understand the panels. What about the rest of the infrastructure to actually get the energy to the home?
Yeah, it's actually pretty minimal because I mean, roughly speaking, I mean, if I look at mine, I have solar panels on the roof, and of course, mine is tied into the grid, but it wouldn't have to be, and it's just a cable running from the solar panels to the
Yes, I
house.
understand when it ties into the existing.
Yeah, but even without that, it's pretty simple. I mean, the smaller scale systems, especially, I mean, the ones I've seen when I've spent time in Nicaragua, for example, it's 2 solar panels on a roof, a wire, a battery, one other little box. That's it in the house. That's it. And the bigger systems have a little more, but it can operate independently and not with a lot of complicated technology. I will say, I mean, it's just clear that it has to be made clear that to generate a certain amount of solar energy does take a bigger area than a power plant. I mean, if you have a 500 megawatt power plant, it's going to take up a certain amount of space for natural gas or coal. That amount of electricity generated by solar will take up more land. And we can start a whole long argument about that, but we also have a lot of parking lots that are paved over, and we've got a lot of rooftops that can do a lot of this. So, yeah, Donna.
I've heard a lot about the electric grid, And my understanding is that our whole nation needs to revise and improve the electric grid. You know, when New York got black at one time.
Yeah.
Because of the lack of actual underlying. So what would you say about that?
I mean, that's something it's part of what's in this Infrastructure Act. It's, you know, we've got these tilting wooden poles still everywhere that are carrying our electricity around. That doesn't look like a modern grid. And one of the ways I look at this is my grandparents, my parents paid a lot of taxes to build a lot of our infrastructure that we still have now. The interstate system, the grid, all of that is from the 50s and 60s. And my generation has basically said, nah, we don't want to pay taxes. We don't want to keep up this infrastructure. And a lot of it is coming due. We need to upgrade, especially if we're going to move forward to renewable energies, to cars that can store energy and feed energy back into the grid, not just take energy out of the grid. It's going to be a more complex system, and it's due for an upgrade anyway. So let's do it in a way that actually prepares us for, well into the future. And there's a lot of people a lot smarter than I am who've been thinking about this. They know what to do. I don't think that's a question. And it does take money. There's no doubt it takes investments. But there's a huge difference between just spending money on stuff and actually investing in for the future. I think it's sometimes missed in the political conversation. Yeah, Louisa.
I just wanted to say one more thing. Hopefully I can do it quickly. The thing is, engaging us in this fight, so to speak, because it's more economical, like to have an electric car or solar panels, or this lasts longer than that, selling it. But something else is at stake here, not just, coming out better. The very soil that we stand on, the climate change will make it impossible for us to live. So these things are rational. These changes are rational, even if they would cost more, it would be needed, but that they cost less is very encouraging. And that's why I said some kind of stupidity that prevents us from doing that. And I'm saying I share in this stupidity myself, no matter how I want to take myself out of it. This equation it's bigger than just a gain in money or status or whatever, or power. It's the very soil that we live on. And it's so urgent. And all those things are good things that people have suggested in transport, not individual cars, but reasonable transport, so I could go to Columbus or to Chicago in a minute, even if I tutter around, you know what I mean? It's unbelievably short-sighted. And it should be approached with a seriousness that is, safe.
Yeah, and I agree. It's urgent. I said at the beginning, there isn't a temperature level at which suddenly humanity perishes, but we make our conditions for living, for thriving, more difficult with every 1/10 of a degree that the planet warms, and that's why we need to do whatever we can to reduce that. So I think that's really the message. I would say we do need to do this. So it is critical. Exactly, soils and what happens to crops with temperature increase. I didn't talk about any of that, but it's all tied together, and we need to be paying attention to all of it at the same time. And that's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's becoming more and more evident. And so that's what we in that generation who were somehow more responsible for it need to make sure that we start and that it carries on to our next generation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.